Asia today has continued to see fairly green on screen moves, particularly in Japan and also across China. There has been a move on from last night with the S&P and the Dow, and that is really filtering through to what we're seeing in Asian trade. The Nikkei particularly is an interesting one. Broke through that psychological barrier of 15,000 points and continues to move higher. There is certainly a real drive going on in that market, and we've also seen a reasonable breakdown in the dollar yen, despite the fact that last night the pair did move up and we are seeing the Nikkei move with it. That breakdown is now really starting to become quite apparent, and the Nikkei itself is now having fundamentals and bottom-up views certainly coming a fact. There was a huge amount of trade data and other forms of data out in Asia across the whole day today. So it has been a very busy day for that reason. We saw Australian retail sales again growing for the 12th consecutive month. However, the growth is very, very flat at 0.3 of 1%. We then saw the services PMI data coming out from China at 55.5. That is a good expansion, but it didn't really move any sort of major markets there. And then we saw the finalisation of the HSBC numbers from last week, and it actually moved slightly back to 49.4 from 49.7, and that sort of caught the market slightly off guard. So the best thing to watch there, we saw the copper price and also the Australian dollar sliding back ever so slightly. We then had a bit of a lull, and then we saw the RBA coming out with rate decisions. As expected, it didn't move at all at 2.5%. It remains on hold and looks like doing that for at least the next 6 months. And looking through the statement, there wasn't a huge amount of sort of information either that could really give you a key as where they're moving. So it is an incredibly neutral statement coupled with an incredible neutral movement with regards to interest rates. So it means we're going to have to wait for the minutes to actually see any sort of moves. But as I said, a very positive day across Asia on the equity bourses. We saw interesting moves in the Aussie dollar if you want to look at a currency, and the dollar yen continues to move higher along with the Nikkei. Asia tomorrow will again be concentrating very heavily on the Australian region with the first quarter GDP numbers due out. Year-on-year consensus is actually quite high at 3.2%, which is above trend. If you look on quarter at 0.8 of 1%, that's also quite a nice number indeed. However, in saying that, we did see very strong numbers out of China at the start of the year. Nominal figures, particularly on their GDP and also their trade balance numbers, were very strong, and that should filter through into the Australian economy. It's the second quarter that we'll be watching quite closely, and whether or not the budget, also some fears around housing and the slowdown in services space over in Australia are actually going to weigh on the Aussie dollar and also on the Australian economy. So GDP to number tomorrow is certainly what we'll be watching. And then around the region, again, watching Japan. Their monetary base has actually shown signs that it is starting to actually slow down after that huge stimulus package that we saw all the way through last year. It's starting to filter out, and we'll be watching the dollar yen quite closely. But tomorrow, with that in mind, we'll be watching very, very closely the ADP numbers heading into the non-farm payrolls on Friday, and I think that pair will be the pair that will actually drive higher because US data looks quite positive. But Japan is certainly one area we're watching. It's had a very, very strong day today. Expectations are for tomorrow for it to be the same as it punches through 15,000 points for the first time since around about February. So that has been a really positive move today, and we expect to see that continuing on tomorrow. But it will be a fairly soft day again. China is certainly the case of what we're watching. Commodities are weak, and they are weakening to lows that we haven't actually seen in over a year and 20 months on something like iron ore. So that may be the drag in Asia tomorrow, but it will be all about GDP in Australia, watching those Japanese numbers and particularly that monetary base, and then leading into the end of the week with the US numbers that will certainly drive the Asian region as a whole.